Over the last few weeks, we've been reading from 1 Corinthians chapter 9, where the Apostle Paul compares the Christian life to running a really long race. And he uses that analogy of a marathon because so much of what endurance athletes go through physically and mentally is a powerful illustration of what it's like to live the Christian life. And Paul is telling us by using the analogy of the long race, the marathon, that pain, adversity, and hardship in life are unavoidable. They're a given, an assumed part of being alive. And if we want to finish well, if we want to endure to the end, if we want to win the race, in the language of Paul in 1 Corinthians 9, then we're going to have to copy the habits of world-class athletes, world-class endurance runners, which left us asking over the last several weeks, we kept asking ourselves this question: how shall we run? With all that in mind, how are we supposed to run this race called life? And in week 1, we answered the question this way: just take the next step. That's how you run to win. The past is history. The future is mystery. So just do what you gotta do to win the next moment. Just take the next step. In preparation for the adventure trip I just went on, I read a lot of articles from extreme mountain climbers to endurance athletes, and there is a quote that helped me tremendously. And it's not just true about the hardship in endurance athleticism. It's not in mountain climbing or running. It's not just true in the hardships of adventure. It's true in the hardships of life. The article said this: when you're experiencing discomfort or pain, the intensity depends a lot on how much further your brain thinks you have to go. It's a concept called anticipatory regulation. When the end is really far away, your rate of perceived exertion is higher, even if the workload or the actual effort is the same. Your body is trying to protect you and make sure you don't empty your reserves. Even though it's well-intentioned, your brain will convince you that you have reached your limit when, in fact, you are quite far from it. One of the most effective strategies to pushing on when things feel impossibly hard is to break up the effort into manageable pieces. When it feels like you can't go any further, left foot, right foot, left foot. Breaking it down to the tiniest forward progress makes it doable no matter how hard it is. In other words, just take the next step. In week 2, last week, here's how we answered that question: how shall we run? By having the right mindset. The race of life is going to be won or lost by what you allow to go on in your mind. You have to change the narrative of your life to align with God's narrative, the storyline that He's written for your life. And Paul describes the two narratives and what we need to do in Romans 12 when he says, don't copy the behavior and the customs of this world. That's one narrative. But let God transform you into a new person. That's a different narrative. How? By changing the way you think. You have to run the race of life with the right mindset. Today we're going to see a third answer to that question: how shall we run? By growing through and embracing pain. The idea of growing through pain is going to consume the rest of our time today. And let me just be really honest with you up front. This is a counterintuitive way of thinking to the American way of thinking. So you may not like it, you may not even want to hear it, but it is a truth undeniably found in Scripture, repeated over and over again in the Bible. The Scripture keeps telling us God uses pain, suffering, and adversity to grow us, shape us, and form us into His image. And if we ignore or deny that reality, we'll limit our spiritual growth and can end up living our lives with a bitter, broken spirit. What Paul says about the pain of life in 1 Corinthians 9 is simply echoing what is said all throughout the Bible. Job says, man is born to trouble as surely as sparks fly upward. The psalmist says, many are the afflictions of the righteous. John 16, Jesus said, here on earth you will have many trials and sorrows. And contrary to popular opinion, being a Christian does not lessen adversity in your life. Following Jesus can actually increase the adversity and hardship in your life. If you don't believe that, just ask our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world who are being persecuted for their faith. Their faith in Jesus is the reason for much of the pain and suffering in their lives. Being a Christian does not remove the reality of pain and suffering, but it should change the narrative. It should change our perspective in the way that we view the adversity that comes into our lives. The Apostle James clearly articulates this very different, radical, and counterintuitive way of looking at hardship and suffering in James chapter number 1 when he says this: "Dear brothers and sisters, when troubles or trials of any kind come your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy. For you know that when your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. So let it grow. For when your endurance is fully developed, you will be perfect and complete, needing nothing." You'll be mature. James is simply saying what Job, Jesus, Paul, and the psalmist have already said. Trouble is inevitable and life is full of pain. The Bible is very honest about the realities of life. But the Bible is also very honest about this promise. God intends to grow us through our pain. If we will cooperate with Him, we can find joy and grow even in the most difficult circumstances. We can grow in our pain. The word trouble that the New Living Translation translates in James 1:2 is most often translated as a trial. Here's James 1:2 in the New International Version. "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds." A trial is anything that comes into your life that breaks up a pattern of peace, comfort, and happiness. And when the word trial is used in Scripture, it's referring to both external tests that come from without and internal tests and temptations that come from within. The trials that come upon us and the trials that come from within us. The Apostle Peter talks about them as fiery trials, and he says they come into our life to test us. Listen to this. "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you." James said the same thing a minute ago in verse 3. He said, "For you know that when your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow." The trials that come into our lives test our faith, but it's not what you're thinking. They are not testing to see if we have any faith. They're not tests to see if there is faith there. The trials are being used by God to perfect the faith that is there, to refine us and mature us. Every time the word testing is found in the Bible, the literal Greek translation of the word means refining of precious metal by fire. In the same way, gold and silver becomes pure through the testing of the refiner's fire. The impurities and the dross in gold, the longer it stays over the fire, are burned out and it becomes pure gold. In the same way, our faith is matured, perfected, and refined by the fiery trials that come into our lives. When you read the whole book of James, you get an insight on the trials that his original audience was facing, what they were going through: poverty and persecution. Some of these people were desperately lacking the basic provisions of life. And on top of that, they were being persecuted for their faith in Jesus. So when James challenges them to grow in their pain, he's not talking to people who are going through some minor stuff. These people are facing real suffering. These are real trials. And he's not minimizing their suffering. He's trying to get them to understand that God's intention is to redeem and use their pain, that they can grow through it, mature in it, be perfected by it if they will just trust the refiner's fire. James is really clear here. In the few short verses of chapter 1 that we read to you, he gives them three very distinct ways that they can grow through their pain. And here's the first thing he tells them: remember, your pain has a purpose. According to verse 3, there's a common denominator in the great variety of trials that we all experience. Those trials test our faith to produce endurance. But you know, when your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. Now, what I'm about to tell you is going to go against preaching you here on Christian television and a lot of pop culture theology. But I clearly see in Scripture where God often sovereignly allows certain trials and hardships into our lives to mature our faith. But most of the pain that comes into our lives happens simply because we live in a sin-sick world. God is not the author of it. He didn't cause it. He simply promises that He won't waste it. That's why I call Him Jehovah Frugal, because He has promised to us that He will not waste our pain. According to the Apostle Paul, He makes all things work together for our good, and that even includes all things, includes the pain, hardship, suffering, and adversity of your life. It's the Joseph principle we talked about last week. Joseph experienced unimaginable heartache, pain, and betrayal at the hands of his brothers. And Joseph knew the source of that pain was the hands of his brothers. But he also knew that God had a master plan to redeem that pain, to use that pain to mature him and shape him for his destiny. You see that when he speaks to his brothers in Genesis 50:20, you intended to harm me. It came from the hands of his brothers, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people. The plans of God are infinitely complex. They are full of wonder and mystery, and we may never fully understand the depth at which God will use our pain or redeem our pain. But one thing is clear: the trials we encounter in our life create endurance. They develop the endurance of our faith. The more traditional biblical word for endurance is steadfastness. So if you look in the King James or the English Standard Version, that's the word you're going to see, not endurance, steadfastness. To be steadfast is to remain under a burden for a long period of time and carry that load through fatigue and difficulty without quitting. Steadfastness is strength. It is power. God's intention for the pain, adversity, and headwinds that you face in life is to grow you into becoming a person of steadfast faith. Elizabeth Elliot has become a spiritual hero of mine. She passed away back in 2015, but when I was a new Christian, I read a lot of books by her husband, Jim Elliot. I read his life journals, things he wrote before he ever married Elizabeth when he was in college. Jim's faith in life and his courage in death. He died in his mid-20s. His courage in death shaped, his faith in life and courage in death shaped my early days as a follower of Jesus. Jim was killed by an indigenous tribe in the jungles of Ecuador that he was attempting to reach with the gospel. As a young mother living on the mission field, Elizabeth Elliot now had a choice: come back to America with her children as a young widow, or continue the work of her husband in missions. In the face of her own fiery trial of overwhelming grief, she chose the latter. She chose to continue the work of missions and actually sought out the people who killed her husband to offer them her forgiveness and share Christ with them. In my mid-20s, I had the privilege of visiting these people, this indigenous tribe in the jungles of Ecuador. I met and shook hands with the man that took Jim Elliot's life. He is now a follower of Jesus along with his whole tribe because of Elizabeth Elliot's steadfast faith. Looking back on the death of her husband and her subsequent ministry to the tribe that killed him, Elizabeth Elliot said, "I learned in that experience who God is in a way I could never have known otherwise. And so I can say to you that suffering is an irreplaceable medium through which I learned an indispensable truth. God is God. Suffering is never for nothing." Suffering is never for nothing. He doesn't waste our pain. James says, remember, your pain has a purpose. James gives us a second way to grow through our pain in chapter 1. He says, rejoice in the potential of your pain. Verse 2, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds. He doesn't say consider it joy when you suffer. He says, consider it pure joy. That's elated, unrestricted joy, pure joy when you suffer. Really? I told you this was a radical, very different, counterintuitive way of looking at life. We're not looking at life through American lenses right now. We're looking at life through purely biblical lenses, and it's all over Scripture. Paul says in Romans 5, we can rejoice too when we run into problems and trials, for we know that they help us develop endurance, and endurance develops strength of character, and character strengthens our confident hope of salvation, and this hope will not lead to disappointment. It's an eternal hope that grows through hardship, and Paul says, take joy in that. Rejoice in that. The Apostle Peter said the same thing in 1 Peter chapter 1. In all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. How do you do that? How do you rejoice when you're buried under a pile of trouble? How do you consider a trial a joy? It all comes down to your values. Your values determine your joys. The only way you can find joy when you meet a trial is if you value growth and progress more than comfort and ease. The great pastor and writer Warren Wiersbe said, our values determine our evaluations. If we value comfort more than character, then trials will upset us. If we value the material and physical more than the spiritual, we will not be able to count it all joy. If we live only for the present and forget about the future, eternity, the trials will make us bitter, not better. And if left unchecked, all of us will get sucked up into a culture whose primary goal is ease and comfort. We have sleep number beds and my pillows and smart home controls and apps that do everything from help us parent our children because we can see where they are and how fast they're driving to do our banking. We have apps that help us control the temperature of the water in the church baptistry. Here's the problem. Our passionate search for ease and comfort is doing nothing for our souls. It doesn't produce steadfastness and endurance. It doesn't produce discipline and power. It doesn't produce faith and holiness. Only trials, headwinds, and adversity do that. So don't give up on the load you're carrying right now. The load of grief, the load of a difficult marriage, the load of a child with special needs that others don't even have the capacity to understand. The load of waiting on a blessing that for some reason in God's sovereignty, He hasn't delivered on yet. The load of fighting against the temptations and personal weaknesses that come from the brokenness of your past. I know there are days when the load seems so heavy, you want to throw in the towel and give up. But if you quit today, you'll never see what God has planned for you tomorrow. And you may not see it now, and you may not realize it now, but you're getting stronger living through this. You're becoming more mature as you live through this experience. But if you walk away from it, you will never experience the person you are on the verge of becoming. There is potential in your pain. Nobody understands the potential in pain more than people who seriously train at a gym. I mean, just walk into a CrossFit gym or any other gym where people are really serious about making gains. Those people value pain. Matter of fact, they come back for more every single day because they know growth and increased performance are on the other side of pain. Pain leads to progress. You've heard it. No pain, no gain. So if God wired the human body so that physical pain and training is the path to enhance physical performance and perfection, wouldn't it make sense? The same is true for the soul. In the end, it all boils down to whether you see yourself as a consumer or a warrior. Consumers take every opportunity they can to create spaces of ease, comfort, luxury, and entertainment. But warriors are sojourners on a journey filled with obstacles and challenges that are designed to test them and shape them for their destiny. Listen, church, this is not heaven. We are not home yet. And the life that we're currently living is a furnace. It is a forge. It is a hammer that is getting us ready for home. And if we embrace the trial and grow through the pain and let God, He will use the trial and the hardship to form us into His image and get us ready for home. When you're committed to growth, you lean into the resistance. You lean into the adversity. You purposefully embrace pain in order to achieve the rewards that are waiting on the other side. When you're committed to growth, you can squeeze the joy out of adversity because you know God's going to use it and you see the potential in it. You want to grow through your pain, James says, remember your pain has a purpose. Number 2, rejoice in the potential of your pain. And number 3, reflect on your response to your pain. What is what you're going through right now revealing about who you are as a person? What is the trial and the way you're responding to it? What is it saying about your character? How are you currently responding to the fiery trial that is going on in your life? Are you medicating it with pleasure, escaping it with distraction, stewing in it with anger, wallowing in it with self-pity, or stalling out in it in quiet desperation? If so, there is another way. You have another option. You can respond differently. But James says if you do, it's going to take an act of your will. He says, consider it pure joy. Considering anything is an act of your will. And then he goes on and say, let steadfastness have its full effect. Letting anything have an effect in your life is a matter of the will. It is a choice. We have to understand that God tries us in order to purify us. He tests us in order to transform us. And we could respond differently to these kind of moments if we could just choose to trust the motives of the refiner. Simply trust His ability to make good on His promise, not to waste our pain. Charles Spurgeon is known as the Prince of Preachers. He became the lead pastor of Metropolitan Tabernacle in London in 1854 at the ripe old age of 20. He was the lead pastor there for 38 years, and under his leadership, Metropolitan Tabernacle became the largest church in the world. But what most people don't know about Charles Spurgeon is that he lived with a fiery trial. He battled deep depression for most of his life. At the age of 21, he had been the pastor there about a year. He and his young wife had twins. Someone in a packed auditorium one day yelled, "Fire!" The stampede out of the building left several people dead. The London newspapers blamed the 21-year-old pastor. It destroyed him. It took him a long time to preach or even look at the Bible again. When he finally returned to the pulpit, he was a very different man. And from that moment on, he never shook depression. He called it melancholy in his writings and in his communication, that he was consumed and never was able to invade this deep, deep depression. He lived with this fiery trial. But when he wrote about it, there's one statement from Spurgeon that eloquently sums up what James and all the other writers of scriptures that we looked at today were saying about our troubles, our trials, our tribulations. Spurgeon said this: "I have learned to kiss the wave that throws me against the rock of ages." He valued the pain of his trial to the degree that he described it as kissing the wave. He embraced it because it made him more like Jesus. Spurgeon embraced the pain. He grew through the pain. He surrendered to the refiner's fire and learned to kiss the wave that threw him against the rock of ages. What an incredible way to respond to the trial. Kiss the wave, embrace the pain, find the value in it, the joy in it, see its purpose and potential to throw you into the arms of the rock of ages. Here's what I want us to do today. I want us to quietly contemplate I want you to quietly contemplate how you are going to respond to the fiery trials in your life. There's a song that was popular on the radio several years ago. It's kind of had its day, ran its course, faded in the background. But there is not a song that sums up exactly what the Word and Spirit is trying to say to us today more than this one. A lot of times at the end of a message like this, we stand and worship, sing our way out. This is not one of those. This is not a stand and sing moment. This is a sit and listen kind of song. It's a think deeply and prayerfully kind of moment. As you listen to the words of this song, I want you to think, what will my response be to the fiery trial we're living through? Will you medicate it with pleasure, try to escape it with distraction, stew in it with anger, wallow in it in self-pity, or stall out in it in quiet desperation? Or will you choose to kiss the wave that throws you against the rock of ages? Prayerfully listen to these words. I stopped early to give us time to do this. Prayerfully listen to these words and consider your response.